What if I told you that the most important mafia war in American history wasn't won by Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, or even Meyer Lansky, but by betrayal? The man who once called himself the boss of bosses, Joe Masseria, thought he was untouchable. Instead, he ended up face down in a Coney Island restaurant, killed by the very men he trusted most. In the late 1920s, New York was a battlefield. Dozens of mafia families fought for control of the city's rackets, bootlegging, gambling, and extortion. At the center of it all stood Giuseppe "Joe the Boss" Masseria. He crowned himself the supreme ruler of the mafia in America. But when you put a crown on your head, you paint a target on your back. And for Masseria, that target got bigger every day. How did Masseria rise so high? And why did his own men betray him in the middle of a war that left the streets of New York soaked in blood? The answer lies in the Castellammarese War, a conflict that killed hundreds, destroyed old mafia traditions, and gave birth to the modern American mob. And Joe Masseria's bloody downfall wasn't just a personal defeat. It was the turning point that allowed Lucky Luciano to rewrite mafia history forever. Stick around, because by the end of this story, you'll see how the losers of the Castellammarese War shaped the mafia as much as the winners. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where history remembers the fallen as much as the famous. Joe Masseria was born in Sicily in 1886. Like many immigrants of the time, he came to America chasing opportunity. But he brought with him something darker, the traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. By the 1910s, New York's Italian underworld was fractured. Different gangs fought over neighborhoods, extortion rackets, and bootlegging groups. Masseria was ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. He climbed the ranks quickly, building alliances and eliminating rivals. Masseria had a style that set him apart. He dressed flashy, ate at the best restaurants, and carried himself like royalty. But more than anything, he believed in absolute power. By the mid-1920s, he declared himself the boss of bosses, the man who demanded loyalty from every Italian gangster in New York. And for a while, it worked. He controlled powerful men like Vito Genovese and Albert Anastasia. He had muscle, money, and influence. Anyone who challenged him was either bought off or buried. But power attracts enemies. And Masseria's greatest enemy was another Sicilian mobster, Salvatore Maranzano. Maranzano was different. He was old school, straight from Castellammarese del Golfo in Sicily. Where Masseria loved flashy clothes and fine dining, Maranzano preached tradition and discipline. He saw himself not as a gangster, but as a Roman general bringing order to chaos. In 1929, tensions exploded. Masseria demanded that Maranzano bow to him as boss of bosses. Maranzano refused. The result was a war that would last nearly 2 years, the Castellammarese War. New York turned into a killing field. Gunmen roamed the streets with Tommy guns hidden under coats. Restaurants, bars, and even homes became ambush sites. Dozens of mobsters were murdered in broad daylight. Masseria's side included heavy hitters like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Albert Anastasia. Maranzano's camp had men like Joseph Bonanno, Joe Profaci, and Stefano Magaddino. And caught between them were younger gangsters, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello, men who saw the old ways as outdated and dangerous. But if Masseria had the power and the muscle, why did the war start to turn against him? The truth is, Joe the Boss was fighting yesterday's war, while his own men were already planning for tomorrow's mafia. By 1931, Masseria's empire was crumbling. His soldiers were exhausted, his allies wavering, and his enemies multiplying. Worse, Lucky Luciano, the brilliant young gangster who had been Masseria's protege, was secretly negotiating with Maranzano. Luciano was tired of the old ways. He believed the mafia needed to run like a business, not a monarchy. Masseria's arrogance and greed were dragging everyone down. So Luciano made a deal. Betray Masseria, and Maranzano would make him second in command of the new order. On April 15, 1931, Luciano invited Masseria to lunch at Nuova Via Tamaro, a restaurant in Coney Island. The two men played cards, ate seafood, and drank wine. Luciano excused himself to the bathroom. That's when Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, and Bugsy Siegel walked in. In seconds, they opened fire. Masseria was hit multiple times in the head and body. He collapsed at the table, still clutching the cards in his hand. The newspapers described it as the end of an era. Joe the boss, once untouchable, was reduced to a bloody corpse in a restaurant booth. But the betrayal didn't just end Masseria, it changed the Mafia forever. With Masseria dead, Maranzano declared himself the new boss of bosses. But his victory was short-lived. Luciano and his allies soon turned on him too, stabbing him to death in his office just months later. The Castellammarese War claimed hundreds of lives, but in the end, it wasn't Masseria or Maranzano who won. It was Luciano, Lansky, and their generation, the young men who built the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, that would rule for decades. Joe Masseria was buried quietly, remembered only as a tyrant who couldn't adapt. He called himself boss of bosses, but in reality, he was the last of the old world gangsters killed by his own men, because he refused to change. So when we talk about the Mafia, we remember Luciano, Lansky, and Genovese. But the story of Joe Masseria reminds us that every empire, no matter how strong, eventually falls, and it usually falls from within. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more untold Mafia histories, because the losers of the past are just as fascinating as the legends who survived.